The second a politician tells you it's going to pay for itself, we all know exactly what that means. I've been pretty active lately in on Facebook, pretty active, kind of putting some opinions out there that maybe I don't usually do, and I'm going to change that up going forward because things that I would normally might be more reticent to talk about, I'm not going to, or I'm going to. And anybody that follows me on and any of the social media should know that most of what I say, particularly as it pertains to politics, the world, society, social media, all of those things, I don't have a dog in the fight. I'm not a fan of one side or the other. I hate them all, and it's always amazing to me how it breaks down whenever you put an opinion out there, like the one that I'm going to go over here. Whenever you put an opinion out there that you almost know what side the person who's arguing is on, no one argues no one argues in the middle. Everybody argues from the right side or the left side. And so the type of things that I put out as an example is we had a statement was made, as we've all heard from the president, talking about no new taxes for people making less than $400,000 on his $3.2 trillion spending bill. And that's ludicrous. He also says there'll be no new spending with it. It'll be a net zero, which is ludicrous. And history tells us that it's ludicrous. We know that this has gone on now really since the 60s. It started in the 60s under LBJ, a little bit under Kennedy, but even he cut taxes as a Democrat. Came through, started with LBJ, and with his Great Society that he put into place, which now I think to date we've spent some $20 trillion on, and there's nothing to show for it. There's educational standards aren't better. Poverty isn't any better. All of those things have flatlined over the last 35, 40 years, and yet we've spent trillions of dollars doing it. Well, he promised that things were going to be a net push relative to the economics of his plan. He promised all of these returns, but the thing about politicians is they get to make promises, then they get to benefit from those promises. And whether or not those promises ever come true, whether or not they ever come to fruition, doesn't matter. But we all sit and vote for that promise. Oh, you're going to cut my taxes? Perfect. I'm going to vote for you. Oh, you're going to give me these things? Perfect. I'm going to vote for you. Regardless of whether or not they ever show up, or regardless of whether or not the fallout from them, either anticipated or unanticipated, but I would put forward that most politicians anticipate exactly the effects of some of the laws that they put into place, some of the budgets that they build. I will put forth that they know that, but there's no votes in that. And so starting in the 60s, that's how LBJ did it. It changed the whole terminology that politicians used for the most part. They always used to promise you the world, but starting in the 60s, into the 70s. 70s were a nightmare for Carter. Into the 80s, where Reagan, along with his Federal Reserve chairman, had to combat interest rates, or we were going to look at hellacious inflation, not unlike what we're staring at now, which we'll get to. And then and that's where the spending really took off. Now, he had multiple reasons for doing that spending, but again, that's where the spending took off. Ultimately, the wall came down in Germany. Russia in the late 80s, early 90s was taken down and forced to split up. And all of that had to do with economics. They could not continue to spend the way that we were. So you could make the argument under Reagan that, and I won't defend this argument vehemently, but the argument could be made that money had to be spent rather than blood, young people's lives. That blood and treasure statement that they make. We decided to spend treasure rather than lose blood, and that's why it was called the Cold War. And ultimately, we took it down. Now, let's say, just for sake of this conversation, that was done as a necessary means to end that Cold War, to open up Germany, to take down the USSR, to make it into the shallow shell of itself that it is now. The problem that was all legitimate, and so the spending that we had coming out of the '80s and into the '90s into George Bush the senior, what set a precedent, if you will. And George Bush the senior, as everyone is very well aware, particularly anybody my age, said in his speech to when he was running for president that he would never. The famous saying was, "Read my lips, no new taxes." So that's what he said. So I took him, excuse me, I took him at his word. That was the first president that I was able to vote for. And I took him at his words. And 2 years into it, what did he do? He raised taxes. And that's really where the spending spree kicked off. Clinton then came in behind him, and I want to give this some numbers. Clinton came in behind him and again continued the spending. But the spending that those guys did in those days are pikers. It's pathetic compared to where we are today. And this is kind of what my lead up is to this. We've got now, you followed George Bush the senior with Clinton, and then you get from Clinton to George Bush the younger. And George Bush the younger in 2000, the late 90s, and then inaugurated in 2000. What really started this craze was him. When he took over, if I have my numbers right, it's roughly about $5 trillion in debt when he took over. That's all of the debt up until that moment. When Reagan took over, it was in the hundreds of millions, just to give it some perspective. So Reagan takes over, it's a hundreds of millions. I believe it sat at about $700 or $800 million for years. And then you get outside of Reagan, where all the spending was taking place, you go through Clinton. Like I said, you get to George Bush the younger, and he puts it on steroids. And he amassed more debt in his 8-year term than we had amassed all of the time previous. For the whole previous 220 odd years, whatever the math is, George Bush spent in his 8 years. So now we're at $10 million, round numbers. Well, then Obama, not to be outdone, he pops in for 8 years, and he goes and he says, well, if George Bush can spend 5, I'm going to spend 10. So he turns around, he spends, again, these are all round numbers, $10 trillion. So now we're $20 trillion in debt in 15 years, where we had been $5 trillion in debt coming into 2000, where we had been hundreds of millions of dollars in debt coming into the 80s. Now, all of a sudden, we're staring at $20 trillion. In comes Donald Trump. I think by the time Donald Trump got in, it might have been 21 or 22. And then you lay COVID in on top of it, and you lay Donald Trump and all his crazy spending, and no cuts anywhere. The government continued to flourish. Budgets continued to go up. And you have what we have, bring in COVID, all the ridiculous extra spending, all the money and checks we wrote to people who were working. Remember, 100 million people got a check from the government during COVID that were not impacted financially by COVID. 100 million. And so that takes place. And all of a sudden, we're staring at $30 trillion in debt. And here now we have one of these, the newest moron, Biden, talking to us about 3.2 trillion here, 1.3 trillion there, another 2 trillion over here, and all of a sudden you're talking about $7 trillion just in these new packages is more money than the United States spent through George Bush in 2000, give or take $1 trillion. It's certainly more money, because it was at $5 trillion when George Bush took over, let's say in 2000. So from 2000 to 2021, we've ran that bad boy up $25 trillion. And I don't know about you guys, but when you start talking about 25 trillion, that's a real number. You start talking about $1 trillion, that's a real number. I'm old enough to remember, Billy and I have talked about this a little bit. My IT guy, Chan's been with me. We were 16-year-old idiots working at McDonald's. That's how we know each other. He's been my IT director forever, going way back into the 90s, and we can remember sitting down, and I would go, because he knew it much better than I do, and I would say, hey, what's the biggest chip we can get now, right? How fast is that processor? And we had to look up. I mean, we knew what $1 trillion was, but it was never a number when I was a kid in 2000. Let's just say what am I, 31 years old in 2000. In 2000, I barely knew what $1 trillion was, because we hadn't had $1 trillion spending budgets up until the 90s. The numbers were in the hundreds of millions. So all of a sudden you have this trillion number, which is this government number. It's way off in the middle of nowhere. It doesn't really mean anything. You're not really attached to it. And life goes on. Now all of a sudden the number becomes 5 trillion. Then all of a sudden it becomes, like I said, it's 15, 20 trillion, and now it's $30 trillion. And we're staring down the face of it. They're trying to add another $4 or $5 trillion to it, trying to tell us that it's not going to cost anything. It pays for itself, which the second a politician tells you it's going to pay for itself, we all know exactly what that means. So why am I saying all this? I wanted to give that background because I'm pissed off, number one. And I'm pissed off every single day. And you all should be pissed off. I have no love for the government whatsoever. Anybody listens to this knows that. I've been right out front with it. The government is our enemy. They are not our friends. The government works for us. We don't work for them. But they got it backwards. The government's broken, has been broken for a long time. We need to do something about that or we're going to end. Go look at your history. It's pretty simple. Check out what did the Romans in, what did the Greeks in, what did the Turks in. Go check out history and see what it is that did these people in. Probably everybody, but Genghis Khan really, I believe what did him in is he was just one in a trillion people, and his son could not continue doing what he had, the standard that he had set. But it's every 250 years, give or take, that these superpowers flourish. And then they disintegrate. And I put a post out the other day talking about they don't disintegrate because they get attacked. They don't disintegrate because somebody comes in and takes them out. And then that's the new, everybody has to bow down and it's Game of Thrones and this village destroyed this village and this town destroyed this town. Ain't how it works, particularly a superpower like we have. How it works is we blow ourselves up from within. And we blow ourselves up from within because we're so fat, we're so happy, we have it so well. Our largesse, our standard of living is unlike anything the world has ever seen, and we blow it, and we're taking it advantage. And that's where all of this woke ideology BS that really does nothing to further society gets to creep up. Look at your history. Go look at the Greeks. Same thing. Go look at the Romans. Same thing. You have to just look at your history to see what took those superpowers down and what happened to them and how it happened to them and how did they begin to behave when all of a sudden there is more than you can possibly have. You have more than you ever need and you spend more than you ever have. It just doesn't make any sense, but this is what governments do. So I said all that to say, and we'll spend lots of time talking about this more in the future, that inflation is coming, and that's the thing that I'm most worried about. When you hear a politician tell us that there is no taxes, they're lying right now. I own a transportation company. I'm paying for gas, and gas is up about 40%. Billy, where you are, it's probably up even more than that, I would guess. What are you paying for fuel out there now?
Close to $4.
Close to $4. So if I remember when I left a year ago, I'm going to guess it was probably still had a 2 in front of it. Yep. Would be my guess. So now you're up $1, $4, 25% in fuel, 33% in fuel over a year. That's insane. It's crazy. I put a post out today about the price of fuel is up, the price of beef is up, the price of milk is up, the price of everything that you buy is up. So much of what we buy is sitting off of the coast, particularly here in the West Coast. There's something like 50 or 60 ships that are just languishing out there because they don't have enough truckers. There's not enough people to drive the truck, so they tell us, right? Or, and let's just back up a second. Remember, anytime the government gives you any kind of these kind of answers, there's not enough people to drive trucks. They've driven people out of driving trucks. No one has any idea, unless you've driven a truck, how complicated it is, aside from driving the truck, to drive a truck. Follow? The paperwork is so complex. The regulations are so many. The opportunity to really make money is so strangled off because of the heavy hand of the government. I'm not saying that we should be out there driving tankers full of gas without proper regulation and without proper signage on them and all that. I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about a piece of paper that stops a product moving from one place to another, and then try to work with the government. Try to make this happen on your own, particularly during COVID. Forget about COVID. Try and do it non-COVID.